Bobby Driscoll, the original voice of Peter Pan, became addicted to narcotics when his acting career failed as he got older. In 1968, two little boys got lost while playing in Manhattan's abandoned underground area, and they found Driscoll's rotting body. His body was surrounded by beer bottles, a religious pamphlet, and a wooden crucifix. He was only 31 years old. This photo shows the dramatic differences between two boys who were exposed to the same smallpox source in 1901. One of them was vaccinated, the other one was not. These punishing shoes were a type of medieval torture device. The victim would have to stand on their tippy toes for as long as they could before falling back and having rusty spikes jammed into their heel. Artist William Udermolen was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 1995. Over the next 5 years, he drew these self-portraits of himself which displayed the devastating effects of the disease.
Wait, so with Alzheimer's, he lost memory? I mean, he kept on losing memory. So he drew such faces, right?
After being shot in the forehead by a drunk man and enduring an 8-year coma, policeman Gary Dockery suddenly woke up. He started talking enthusiastically, recognizing old friends and recalling events from past years. But by the very next day, he could no longer speak, and he slipped back into the same coma and never woke up again. In the 1980s, a family owned and operated a ceramics factory in California called Oscar Ceramics. But in 1987, the factory was revealed to be an illegal crematorium. This was only uncovered when a passerby, who happened to be a Holocaust survivor, recognized the smell of burning bodies from his time at Auschwitz.
Imagine being shot in the forehead and then waking up.
In 1985, a 13-year-old Colombian girl was trapped up to her waist in volcanic mud flow. She was mostly alert and was interviewed, but rescuers couldn't find a way to save her. Knowing she would certainly die, volunteers did their best to comfort her. She died after 60 hours, and her image became iconic. In 2008, a Brazilian priest strapped 1,000 balloons onto a lawn chair and rode it into the sky as part of a fundraiser. He was able to reach an altitude of 20,000 feet before losing contact with authorities. Over a month later, the lower half of his body was found floating near an oil rig.
Imagine suffering for 60 hours and then you die. That's horrific.
After being diagnosed with polio at age 3, Diane Odell spent nearly 60 years encased in a 750-pound iron lung. She only died when a power outage shut down the machine that had been keeping her alive for decades. Do you know why you wake up right before you're about to die in a dream? It's because your brain doesn't know what it's actually like to experience death. In 1901, Madame Bobbin from England fell ill late into her pregnancy and was pronounced dead. But a few days later, one of the nurses was tormented by the idea that she may have been buried alive. After Madame Bobbin's father was alerted of this, he demanded that the grave be dug up immediately. When the coffin was open, he was horrified to find the corpse of a baby with an uncut umbilical cord laying between his now dead daughter's legs. Young filmmaker Lee Halpin was filming a documentary about the hardships of being homeless by living as one. But he was found dead in the streets only 3 days into filming. The nuclear blast in Hiroshima was so powerful that some people were vaporized instantly, leaving only shadow imprints of their final moments. The woman who voiced the demon Pazuzu in The Exorcist had a son who killed his whole family. He then proceeded to shoot himself in both temples simultaneously. And he did all of this while wearing a Freddy Krueger mask. The White House owns a doomsday plane in the case of an end-of-the-world event. It is a modified Boeing 747 that can apparently withstand terrorist attacks, a nuclear bomb, and asteroid blasts. It can also stay airborne for days without refueling. In 2011, Tokyo officials went to congratulate the oldest man in the city on his 111th birthday. But instead, they found his mummified remains laying on his bed. He had been dead for 30 years and his family was still collecting the pension money that he was receiving.
So they were going to give him the medal, but what they didn't know that he already died, because the family faked it all for the pension.
A grieving mother from Florida added a sandbox to the gravesite of her baby boy so that her older son could play with him. Forced standing was a barbaric form of treatment that was believed to be a cure for insanity in the 19th century. The mental patient would be forced to stand in a compact cell for days at a time with very limited food, water, and outside contact. This is a real photo of a patient enduring this treatment at a Texas mental institution in 1890. In 1977, the University of Evansville men's basketball team was involved in a tragic plane crash. The crash killed every player on the team, except for one man who didn't make the trip due to an injury. 2 weeks later, the only remaining player was killed by a drunk driver.
I mean, late 1800 was so brutal. Anything out of ordinary, and people will label you as witch. And then comes your holy grail.
Jake Thompson was home alone when he had both of his arms ripped off in a farming accident. However, he still managed to get up and dial 911 with a pencil in his mouth. He miraculously survived and both of his arms were reattached. For centuries, there was a paint pigment called mummy brown that was made out of the ground-up remains of ancient Egyptian mummies. The color was manufactured until 1964, when the supply of ancient mummies was finally expended. This is a photo of two engineers embracing for one final hug while standing on top of a wind turbine engulfed in flames. One of the men jumped to escape the fire, while the other one was burned alive while attempting to reach the staircase.
I imagine you're gonna die, and you have no other option. What you gonna do?
72-year-old David Lee Niles was reported missing in 2006. 5 years later, his family held a funeral for their lost loved one, despite not finding his body yet. But eventually, Google Earth users found this car trapped in a pond near David's home. When they went to search it, David's skeletal remains were found in the car. A doctor chronicled the progression of Alzheimer's disease in one of his patients by collecting her signatures on medical forms over the years. In 2011, a 49-year-old Russian woman had a heart attack and was presumed dead. A few days later, she woke up at her own wake and was so shocked that she screamed and had another heart attack, this time dying for real.
Okay, so she survived the first heart attack, but the second one, not so much.
At age 25, a woman named Blanche Monnier had her heart set on marrying a lawyer that her mother wasn't too fond of. When she disappeared one day, most assumed that she had simply run off with him. But 25 years later, someone sent local authorities an anonymous letter saying her mother was holding her hostage. When they arrived at the home, they found Blanche bound and starving in the attic. Dying is forbidden in the town of Longyearbyen, Norway, or at least you won't be buried there. The town's only cemetery closed over 70 years ago because it's so cold that the bodies buried there previously never decomposed. The problem is that some corpses still carry traces of the Spanish flu virus that killed up to 50 million people worldwide around 100 years ago.
A graveyard where the bodies never decompose. That is a scary graveyard.
This girl's jaw was hanging on by a centimeter of skin after a horrific horse riding accident. The injuries sustained by Emily Eccles were the worst her surgeon had seen outside of a war zone. But reconstructive surgeon Ricardo Muhammad Ali was able to rebuild her face during a 6-hour operation. The photo on the right is her back in school just 1 month after the accident. This was a white hearse used for children's funerals back in the 1930s. A boy genius named Brendan Bremer was able to read at 18 months, graduated high school at age 10, and composed music. He tragically shot himself at age 14 to donate his organs to those in need.
I mean, when you get to do so much at such a young age, there is so much burden on you. I mean, that's why. Could be.
A dead French girl ended up having the most kissed lips in history. In the late 1800s, an unidentified girl was pulled out of the Seine River in Paris after drowning. A pathologist at the morgue was apparently so taken by her beauty that he casted a plastered death mask of her face. This death mask would become the face of CPR Annie, the most widely produced CPR mannequin in the world.
Oh, so this is where the CPR mannequin originated.
There are currently hundreds of deceased people in the US whose bodies are frozen in liquid nitrogen, including baseball legend Ted Williams. The hope is that future technology will be able to revive them one day. While this could possibly work, cryogenic freezing has proven to be a terribly risky operation. In one instance, the Cryonics Society of California ran out of money and couldn't keep their customers frozen, so the bodies began to thaw and decompose. Some of the bodies even went missing, and to this day, their families still don't know what happened to them.
I mean, you can keep freezing till the end of times. But what you gonna do with just a body when there's no soul?
A Texas farmer found this astronaut helmet in his field following the Columbia disaster that killed 7 space shuttle crew members in 2003. Along with pieces of the shuttle and equipment, searchers in the debris field also found human body parts, including arms, feet, a torso, and a heart. These are the stomach contents of a psychiatric patient who died with pica disorder. It is a disease characterized by a heightened appetite for inedible objects. Oftentimes, patients with pica disorder would be permanently placed in completely empty rooms without any of their clothes. Otherwise, they would eat them. Mount Everest has hundreds of bodies of dead climbers on it, which now serve as trail markers to the top. It is considered the world's largest open-air graveyard. Some were lucky enough to die in their sleep, while others suffered injuries from falls and slowly died to hypothermia. 2 bakery workers died in agony after being sent into a giant bagel oven to carry out repairs. The repair was a delicate procedure that involved crawling through a tight 75-foot-long conveyor belt that slowly cooks bagels. The machine should have been left to cool for 12 hours, but turned back on after only 2. Within 5 minutes, the men were relaying terrifying messages over their walkie-talkies, saying the oven's core was way too hot. But there was no way of reversing the conveyor belt, and they were trapped on its journey through the oven. 44-year-old Ian Erickson managed to crawl out the other end, but died on the factory floor in front of horrified workmates. 47-year-old David Mays collapsed inside and was caught in the machinery. He died from 80% burns and multiple broken bones.
That is why. Safety first.
After an accident at the Tokemura nuclear plant in 1999, nuclear technician Hisashi Ouchi received a fatal dose of radiation. The dose was believed to be nearly equivalent to the energy produced at the hypocenter of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. Ouchi's exposure to the radiation was so severe that his chromosomes were basically melted and his white blood cell count plummeted to near 0. Unfortunately for Ouchi, doctors saw this as an opportunity to see how long they could keep him alive. They gave him revolutionary cancer treatment, as well as many skin grafts and blood transfusions. On the 59th day, he suffered 3 heart attacks in under an hour. The treatment went on and on for 83 days total, until Ouchi finally died from organ failure. An Indian farmer named Sanju Bhagat lived for 36 years looking like he was pregnant. But one day he was rushed to the hospital because he was having trouble breathing. Doctors initially assumed that a tumor was growing inside his abdomen, but upon operating, they saw something that they had never seen before. They realized that he must have absorbed his twin in the womb and had been carrying it around for 36 years. This is an extremely rare condition called fetus in fetu, where one twin has been absorbed but continues to leach on the host's blood supply and nutrition. The fetus had grown teeth, hair, limbs, and even genitalia. The parasitic twin was eventually removed and Sanju made a full recovery.
Oh, so this explains why he was so malnutritioned. The twin was sucking all the nutrients.
When Ashton Kutcher was 13, he almost committed suicide by jumping off a hospital roof. His twin brother with cerebral palsy had only hours to live if he didn't get a heart transplant, so Ashton wanted to give him his. He was saved when his father and a nurse informed him that his brother had just received a donor. This is the gravestone of Elijah Bond, the man who patented the Ouija board. In 1871, a man survived the fire and sinking of a ship, but it gave him PTSD. 41 years later, he was finally able to overcome his fear and sail again, only to die in the sinking of that new ship, called the Titanic. A South African man named Martin Pistorius lived through an actual nightmare. When he was 12 years old, Martin got sick and fell into a coma where he remained in a vegetative state for 12 years. Or at least, doctors thought it was a vegetative state. Because 2 years into the coma, Martin regained consciousness, but was unable to show any sign of it. So he was trapped in a lifeless state for an entire decade while being fully aware of everything going on around him. He said one of the worst parts was when the daycare lady would sit him in front of children and baby TV shows all day long. On multiple occasions, he also heard his mother say, "I hope you die." Today, Martin can speak through a computer and move with a wheelchair, as his awareness has fully returned.
And the worst part about this is that the nurse actually tortured him. by making him sit in front of a children's cartoon.
In 1933, a Japanese schoolgirl committed suicide by jumping into a volcanic crater on the island of Oshima. This started a bizarre trend in Japan, since in the following year, hundreds of people jumped into the same crater. Though all of these people were seeking mercy, jumping into an active volcano is a terrible way to die. Since your body isn't dense enough to sink into lava, you'd likely burst into flames on the surface and slowly burn to death. It would be like resting on a bed of molten rock 4 times hotter than the broiler in an oven. And it could take up to 10 minutes to die as your body is slowly consumed by flames. Luckily, authorities eventually built a fence around the volcano. In 1978, Charlie Chaplin's body was stolen and held for ransom, but his widow refused to pay ransom demands of 400,000 euros because she said Charlie would have thought it to be ridiculous. His body was found in a cornfield 11 weeks later, and the 2 suspects were apprehended. A woman in Florida once spent 6 straight years sitting on a couch. She died during a surgery that attempted to remove her skin that was grafted into the fabric. Frank Hayes was a jockey who suffered a fatal heart attack and died in the middle of a horse race in 1923. His body, however, remained on the saddle throughout the race, as his horse Sweet Kiss crossed the finish line ahead of the rest, thus winning the race. This was the first time Hayes had ever won a race. And the last. In 1880, the Queen of Thailand's boat capsized on the way to her palace. Despite many witnesses, nobody dared to save the drowning queen and her daughter. This was because touching the queen under any circumstances was a crime punishable by death. The lowest form of accommodation in Victorian England was a place where you could dangle on a rope overnight for the price of a penny. For centuries, the feet of Chinese women were tightly bound from a young age as part of a traditional custom, causing the breaking and bending of the bones of the toe. This resulted in extremely disfigured feet that resembled the hooves of animals.
Imagine not saving a drowning person, or rather a drowning princess, because it is strictly prohibited in your country.